A white male police officer, arrogant and infamous for abusing his authority, faces off against a formidable black female judge. Believing his power would shield him from any wrongdoing, he displays blatant disrespect. Yet her sharp and unyielding verdict leaves the courtroom in stunned silence, delivering a powerful lesson on justice. Are you reading this somewhere? Share it now and subscribe to stay tuned for more compelling stories. Monday morning, Los Angeles County Courthouse. Sunlight filters through towering glass windows, illuminating the vast halls filled with hurried footsteps. Despite the warm glow, the air inside feels heavy, as though burdened by an unseen weight. The whispers of reporters, attorneys, and spectators blend into a restless symphony of unease. All eyes are fixed on the center of attention this morning. John Carter, a middle-aged white police officer striding confidently through the courthouse. His face is stoic, his every step deliberate, as if daring the world to challenge him. John is not only known for his boldness on the job, but also rumored for his unchecked aggression and abuse of power. He's evaded accountability numerous times, thanks to influential connections and the protective shield of his badge. But this time, the stakes are different. John faces a grave accusation, assaulting Jamal Price, an unarmed 22-year-old black man, in a situation that did not call for violence. The incident occurred late at night on a deserted street. Dashboard camera footage and eyewitness accounts reveal John shoving Jamal to the ground and repeatedly striking him, even though Jamal offered no resistance. The consequences of the assault were severe. Jamal was hospitalized with broken ribs, extensive bruising, and lasting emotional trauma. The community erupted in outrage, especially as racial tensions continued to rise. This was no longer just a case of assault. It had become a symbol of unchecked authority and systemic injustice. Presiding over today's trial is Judge Harriet Grant, a renowned black woman with an impeccable reputation in the legal field. Harriet is known for her steadfast principles, piercing eyes, and commanding yet compassionate demeanor. From her seat on the bench, she upholds a simple but unwavering philosophy. No one is above the law, whether they wear a badge or wield power. For Harriet, every trial is not merely about justice for the case at hand, but an opportunity to restore faith in the legal system. Under the watchful and anxious gaze of the public, Harriet understands that today is about more than just one man's actions. It is a statement of law against arrogance and abuse of power. As John Carter steps into the courtroom, light streams through the grand windows behind him, casting a stark silhouette. The murmurs in the room fall silent. The clash between authority and justice is about to begin. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew tense as John Carter stepped through the large wooden doors. With the demeanor of a man accustomed to facing authority, he walked calmly, shoulders squared, chin held high. His finely tailored black suit clung to his robust, middle-aged frame, emphasizing that this was not a man easily subdued. John's gaze swept across the crowded courtroom, skimming over reporters, the victim's family, and onlookers as if they were mere spectators in his performance. Reaching the defendant's table, he sat down slowly, leaned back in his chair, crossed his legs, and rested his hands on his knees. A faint smirk appeared on his lips as he glanced at Judge Harriet Grant. John didn't need to say anything. His demeanor said it all. This was just a temporary challenge, a minor obstacle he would easily overcome, just as he had in the past. The prosecutor, a diminutive man with a clear and cutting voice, rose to open the proceedings. He laid out the details of the case, starting with the moment John Carter approached Jamal Price on a deserted street, leading to the blows that left Jamal with broken ribs, motionless on the ground. Footage from a dashcam video played on a large screen. In the video, Jamal's faint cries could be heard, mingled with the heavy sound of John's footsteps approaching. There was no indication of resistance from Jamal, yet John shoved him to the ground and repeatedly struck him with a baton, targeting his back and legs. Mr. Carter not only used excessive force, the prosecutor declared in a steely voice, but he also gravely violated the ethical standards and responsibilities of a police officer. His actions didn't just harm Jamal Price, they eroded the community's trust in those tasked with protecting them. John remained seated in his relaxed posture, his eyes fixed on the screen, betraying no emotion. When the video ended, he merely shrugged, as though watching a scene that had nothing to do with him. The room fell silent as Angela Price, Jamal's mother, was invited to speak. A middle-aged woman with sunken eyes and a frail frame, she walked to the stand slowly, clutching a small piece of paper as if to summon courage. Her voice trembled but held firm as she began. "Your actions didn't just hurt my son. They shattered this community's trust in those who are supposed to protect us." She paused, her tear-filled eyes locking onto John. "My Jamal was not a criminal. He was just walking home after his night shift. But you made him a target you could attack without cause." A sigh rippled through the room. Some lowered their heads, while others glared at John with fury in their eyes. Yet John, unflinching, tapped his fingers lightly on the table, his expression cold and detached. As Angela stepped down, silent tears streaming down her face, John straightened up. Turning to Judge Harriet Grant, he spoke in a loud, deliberate voice, cutting off the prosecutor mid-sentence. "With all due respect, I did nothing wrong. My actions were meant to ensure public safety." John's words sliced through the tension in the room like a knife. Some onlookers gasped in shock. Jamal's family sat motionless, their eyes blazing with anger. Undeterred, John continued. "That young man was behaving suspiciously. Given the current circumstances, I couldn't risk an unexpected attack. I did what I needed to do, and I would do it again if faced with the same situation." The prosecutor immediately objected. "Mr. Carter, there is no evidence to suggest that Jamal Price exhibited any threatening behavior. Every witness has testified that he was simply walking." John shrugged again, his gaze defiant. "Being a police officer isn't always easy. Sometimes we have to make split-second decisions, and I won't apologize for doing my job." Throughout John's display, Judge Harriet Grant remained silent. Her sharp yet composed eyes and clasped hands conveyed a quiet authority. She didn't need to speak. Her gaze alone was enough to intensify the tension in the room. When John finally sat down, the smugness evident on his face, Harriet lowered her glasses slightly and looked directly at him. There was no anger, no judgment, only an impenetrable calm, as if she were waiting for John to expose his true self. "Mr. Carter," Harriet finally said, her voice slow but resonant, echoing across the courtroom. "We will have ample opportunity to discuss the definition of responsibility. But first, I suggest you listen carefully to what others have to say during this trial. This is not a performance, and you're not the main character." The courtroom fell silent. John's smirk faltered ever so slightly. No one spoke, but it was clear to everyone that the real battle had just begun. The air in the courtroom remained heavy with tension after John Carter's arrogant declaration. A few glances shifted toward Judge Harriet Grant, awaiting her reaction. But Harriet didn't rush to respond. She calmly removed her glasses from the bridge of her nose, placed them deliberately on the table, and fixed her gaze on John. "Mr. Carter," Harriet's voice rang out, not loud but sharp as a blade, cutting through the thick atmosphere of the room. "I will keep this brief so you fully understand. The law does not tolerate unprovoked violence, no matter who commits it, whether it's a civilian or a police officer. If you refuse to take responsibility now, the consequences will be far worse than you imagine." Harriet paused, her unwavering gaze seemingly compelling John to confront his own conscience. Yet John didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into a mocking smile. "With all due respect," John replied, emphasizing each word as if to undercut Harriet's authority, "I don't think I need a judge to teach me how to do my job as a police officer." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. John's words were not just defiance, they were an open challenge to Harriet. All eyes turned toward her, anticipating the response of a judge renowned for her composure but unyielding when faced with arrogance. Harriet didn't move. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes held a stormy intensity that only John could feel. She placed both hands on the bench and leaned forward, closing the distance between them as if to shrink the space between power and accountability. "Mr. Carter," Harriet said, her voice dropping but growing heavier with every word, "I've heard countless defenses in my career. I've met people who believed their authority placed them above the law. But I always tell them, and today I'll tell you, power doesn't shield you from responsibility. It only exposes your weakness if you abuse it." John stayed silent for a moment. Then he chuckled softly, his eyes glinting with defiance. "I know exactly what I'm doing, Your Honor, and I won't let anyone, not even you, lecture me on how to do my job." John's words were more than arrogance, they revealed his essence, a man who believed his authority was absolute. Since his early days on the force, John had learned to wield his power to control every situation, regardless of right or wrong. To him, the law was not a boundary, but a tool for his convenience. Public safety, John often claimed, was his mantra to justify every action. But deep down, he knew power was the only thing that gave him a sense of significance. Harriet understood this all too well. Her piercing gaze seemed to strip away John's facade. She didn't need him to admit guilt at this moment, but she knew this trial would be the ultimate test for both of them. Harriet would confront John's obstinance, while John would face the consequences of the mistakes he had long ignored. Harriet lightly tapped her gavel on the bench, silencing the murmurs in the courtroom. "Mr. Carter, let me remind you that I am not here to debate with you. I am here to ensure that justice is served, and I urge you to think carefully about how you wish to be remembered in this courtroom. As a man brave enough to accept responsibility, or as an abuser of power exposed before the community." John bit his lower lip, a fleeting sign that Harriet's words had struck a nerve, but he quickly regained his usual smug demeanor. "Your Honor, I know the law very well, and I also know how to protect myself." Harriet tilted her head slightly, a faint smile playing on her lips, not out of amusement, but because she had seen countless men like John Carter before, and she knew the real battle had only just begun. The courtroom fell into silence. Harriet turned a page in the file before her, her eyes occasionally flicking toward John. The trial continued, but both sides understood that this was more than a battle between the law and arrogance. It was a test of justice against a power too accustomed to standing above everyone else. In the hushed atmosphere of the courtroom, every gaze was fixed on Judge Harriet Grant. She lifted her head after reviewing the case file one final time, her hands clasped tightly in front of her on the bench. A prolonged silence filled the room, as if to ensure that every soul present was focused entirely on the words about to be spoken. "Mr. Carter," Harriet began, her voice calm, yet carrying a power that commanded the room's full attention. "Your actions not only violated professional ethics, but also represented a blatant abuse of authority. As a police officer, your duty is to protect the community. Instead, you inflicted unnecessary harm upon an innocent individual." She paused, her eyes locking onto John Carter's face, searching for any hint of remorse, however faint. But John sat there, leaning back in his chair, lips curling in a faint smirk, as if bracing himself for yet another meaningless lecture. Her voice deepened, emphasizing each word. "The law does not tolerate arrogance, nor does it allow power to obscure justice. I have carefully considered the circumstances, and instead of imposing a severe punitive sentence, I aim to give you an opportunity to grasp the gravity of your actions." The tension in the courtroom was palpable, the air thick with anticipation, as Harriet delivered her verdict. "You will be required to complete 300 hours of community service at the Los Angeles Veterans Support Center, a place dedicated to those who have sacrificed for this country. Additionally, you will attend a behavioral control course and undergo human rights training to better understand your responsibilities to the community you swore to protect." John straightened, his eyes narrowing as though he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. A moment passed, and then he let out a bitter laugh, the sound chilling in the solemn atmosphere of the courtroom. "Your Honor," he said, drawing out each word with evident sarcasm, "I was expecting a harsher sentence, but apparently this is just a public relations stunt, isn't it?" His words sent a ripple of murmurs through the courtroom, many faces filled with indignation. Yet Harriet remained unmoved. She stayed silent, watching John with a calm demeanor, as if inviting him to expose his true nature further. John pressed on, his voice laced with defiance. "I don't see how mopping floors or serving meals to a bunch of failures will change anything, and it certainly won't alter the fact that I was right in that situation." Harriet's eyes narrowed slightly, not out of anger, but disappointment. She understood the core of John Carter, a man so accustomed to wielding power as a shield that he believed himself untouchable. But she also knew that sometimes the most profound lessons emerged from experiences beyond one's control. Though John's exterior remained defiant, deep down, a sense of unease began to creep in. This sentence was unlike any punishment he had faced before. It wasn't a fine he could pay, off, or a temporary suspension he could wait out. It was an experience he couldn't bribe or manipulate. The thought of working at the Veteran Support Center, a place inhabited by people who had truly sacrificed, people John secretly disdained, made him deeply uncomfortable. John drew a deep breath, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Inwardly, he thought, "Fine. I'll get through this like a temporary chore and then I'll return to my rightful place. This is just a minor setback, nothing more." But Harriet's gaze, steady and penetrating from her seat on the bench, seemed to pierce through his facade of indifference, exposing the cracks beneath. With a measured strike of her gavel, she declared, "Court is adjourned. Mr. Carter, I sincerely hope you reflect deeply on the journey you're about to undertake." John rose, adjusting his suit jacket, and strode out of the courtroom with an air of composure. Yet, within him, an unnameable sensation began to take root, a feeling he refused to acknowledge. Was this the moment everything he had believed in was about to crumble? John Carter stepped out of the courtroom with a faint trace of smugness still lingering on his face. Yet, a few days later, as the doors of the Veteran Support Center came into view, that confidence began to crack. The building was modest, tucked into a corner of the street, unassuming with its white walls now faded by time and a small sign that read, "A place to rebuild lives." John frowned. The name sounded overly sentimental to him, a man who had always believed in strength and personal power. Rebuild lives, he thought. Just an excuse for failures to wallow in self-pity. From the moment he stepped through the doors, John's attitude was clear. He didn't bother looking at anyone, merely accepting the light blue uniform handed to him by the center manager with a cold indifference. When assigned the task of cleaning the dining area, he scowled, gripping the mop as though it were some foreign tool unfit for someone like him. The staff and veterans at the center all noticed him, a middle-aged man with an air of arrogance, his cold eyes practically announcing that he didn't belong there. But no one said anything. They simply continued their work in quiet diligence. John spent his first morning doing the bare minimum, giving the floors a cursory swipe, unconcerned with the results. When asked to organize the dining room, he worked begrudgingly, casting occasional glances at the wall clock, as if willing time to move faster. "This is just a temporary obligation," he muttered to himself. "Nothing here is worth my attention." Things changed that afternoon when John wandered into the common area. It was a simple room with a few worn armchairs, a small television emitting faint crackles, and veterans gathered to chat or read. John, trying to avoid attention, searched for a secluded corner. That's when he saw her. A young female veteran, Maria, with short-cropped hair and a prominent scar running from her left cheek to her chin, was pushing a wheelchair. Sitting in the wheelchair was an older man, frail in appearance but with a warm smile, talking incessantly to Maria. She leaned down, gently adjusting his posture, patiently listening to his rambling stories, her eyes shining with genuine respect and care. John stood at a distance, unable to look away from the scene. A part of him wanted to scoff, another display of fake kindness to create a feel-good atmosphere. Yet another part of him felt strangely unsettled. The woman with the scar made no effort to hide her imperfections, nor did she show any pity toward the man in the wheelchair. Every action she took was deliberate, meticulous, as though he were the most important person in the world at that moment. John turned away, a sense of discomfort stirring within him. Throughout his career as a police officer, he had witnessed and carried out countless acts of strength, but never acts like this. Patience, compassion, they made him feel small and out of place. That evening, as he left the center, an unfamiliar feeling lingered with him. Maria hadn't said a word to him, but the image of her bending down to care for that veteran haunted his mind. Why does she do it? He wondered. She could just do the bare minimum and still get praised. So why put in so much effort? The question had no answer, but it left a crack in him, a sense of unease, as though his indifference and arrogance had been challenged by something he couldn't understand, and didn't want to understand. John's first day at the center ended without any outward change in him, but deep down, the seed of doubt had been planted. A small part of him was beginning to question whether his view of the world and himself was truly right. On the third morning at the center, John Carter walked in with his usual demeanor, upright posture, head held high, but his usual arrogance seemed slightly diminished. The memory of what he had witnessed from Maria the day before lingered in his mind, though he quickly pushed it aside. Work is work, he reminded himself. Just get it done. While tidying up the common area, a deep, commanding voice echoed from behind him. Do you think you're strong because of your power? John turned to face James, a former soldier with a burly build but an air of premature aging. James's face was etched with hardship, his eyes sunken and haunted, carrying the weight of a lifetime of pain. His left arm was missing from the elbow down, replaced by a metal hook. John raised an eyebrow, placing his hands on his hips. And you think you have the right to judge me? James stepped closer, his gaze sharp as a dagger, unfazed by John's confident stance. He stopped right in front of him, lowering his voice, which only made it more piercing. Your power only hurts others. That's not strength. It's just a facade for your weakness. The room fell silent. A few other veterans nearby paused their activities, their eyes drawn to the confrontation between the two men. John smirked, a mocking smile spreading across his face. And you think the people here, failures living off charity, are qualified to talk about strength? James didn't flinch. He took another step forward, closing the gap between them to an almost suffocating distance. We, the so-called failures you speak of, fought to protect people like you. And you, who have you ever protected? John clenched his fists, feeling a surge of anger rising in his chest. I've protected this whole city. I've stood on the front lines to maintain order, to keep people like you from harming the innocent. James raised an eyebrow, a faint smile of disdain flickering across his face. Order? Men like you don't protect order. You protect yourselves, your petty power. You don't know the first thing about sacrifice. John felt the heat rushing to his face. He opened his mouth to retort, but James continued, his words slicing through John's pride like a blade. Do you even know what it's like to lose everything? I've given my arm, my family, my entire life for what I believed in. But you use your power to trample on others. You're not strong. You're just hiding behind the badge on your chest. James's words hung in the air, leaving a heavy silence. John stared at him, his eyes blazing with anger, but also flickering with something else. Doubt. Taking a deep breath, John steadied himself, trying to regain his composure. I don't have to listen to this drivel. You people here just wallow in your past. If you were as strong as you claim, why do you need a place like this to lean on? James let out a laugh, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was the laugh of someone who had endured far too much to care about petty insults. You don't get it because you've never lost anything that matters. But keep going. One day, you'll realize the emptiness inside yourself. James turned and walked away, leaving John standing alone in the room. The gazes from the others were no longer curious but filled with disappointment, not aimed at James, but at John. John sat down on a nearby chair, trying to suppress the anger boiling inside him. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, James's words echoed in his mind, refusing to be silenced. You're not strong. You're just hiding from responsibility. Though he didn't want to admit it, John felt an uncomfortable unease creeping into his heart, as if those words had struck a truth he had long ignored. That evening, as John left the center, he didn't feel the usual sense of relief. He glanced down at his hands. hands that had once wielded power, enforced order, and, for the first time, they no longer felt as steady as they once had. The next morning, John returned to the center, his face as rigid as a perfectly crafted mask. The confrontation with James the day before had kept him awake all night, but he refused to admit that James's words had left a crack in his armor of arrogance. He told himself, "They're just failures clinging to the past. Me? I'm different. I have strength, power. What they say means nothing." But deep down, a quiet voice lingered, unsettling him. "And you? Are you truly strong?" As John was cleaning the common area, he noticed Joe, an older veteran with snow-white hair and an ever-present smile. Joe was sitting in an old armchair, sharing stories with a small group of others at the center. Laughter echoed from the group, irritating John. He wondered how someone who seemed to have lost everything could remain so optimistic. When the others dispersed, Joe was left alone, his gaze distant but still gentle. John walked over, partly out of curiosity and partly to shake off the feeling of isolation among people he regarded with disdain. "What's so funny?" John asked, his tone edged with sarcasm. Joe looked up, unaffected by John's attitude. Instead, he smiled and patted the chair beside him, inviting John to sit. "It was a story about the last time I saw my family," Joe said, his voice calm and warm. John hesitated but sat down, unable to resist his curiosity. "Your family?" Joe nodded, his eyes growing distant. He recounted his time during the war, when he was deployed to a battlefield thousands of miles from home. Throughout his service, he had received only a few letters from his wife and young son. Then, one day, the last letter brought no good news. "My home was hit by a bomb during an air raid," Joe said, his voice steady, though pain lingered in his eyes. "My wife and son didn't make it out in time." John felt a lump in his throat. "At first, I didn't think I could go on. But then I realized that if I didn't stand back up, their sacrifice would have been in vain. I couldn't change the past, but I could choose how to live in the future." Joe turned to John, his smile gentle but his words sharp. "We've all lost everything, yet we find ways to keep going. What about you?" The question left John speechless. He sat in silence, feeling as though he had been pulled down from the heights of self-righteousness, forced to confront himself. That afternoon, while cleaning the kitchen, John caught sight of Maria standing alone near a window. The large scar on her face shimmered in the sunlight, a stark reminder of a battle John could not begin to comprehend. "Ever wonder about this scar?" Maria asked, her back still to him. John was startled. He started to deny it, but the look in Maria's eyes when she turned stopped him mid-sentence. "I got this scar while on duty," she said, her voice even but laced with emotion. "My team and I were ambushed. A grenade exploded near us, and this fragment," she gestured to her cheek, "is the one thing that reminds me I survived." John struggled to find words. Maria continued, her eyes softening, but her voice growing more profound. "When I came home, I thought I'd never be able to face how people looked at me. They saw me as a monster, not a person. But then I realized what matters isn't how they see me, it's how I see myself." She gave him a faint smile, her gaze shining with an inner strength John had never encountered before. "This scar isn't just a mark of pain, it's proof that I overcame. If I gave up, the scar would win. But I'll never let it win." John felt a tightening in his chest. Maria's words were like a mirror reflecting his own image. Someone who had hidden his failures behind a facade of power instead of confronting and overcoming them. That night, John couldn't sleep. The stories of Joe and Maria replayed in his mind like an unrelenting stream of water. We've all lost everything, yet we find ways to keep going. If I gave up, the scar would win. For the first time, John began to ask himself, am I truly strong, or am I just someone hiding behind power? The question haunted him, forcing him to face a truth he had long avoided, the emptiness within himself. John Carter sat alone on an old wooden bench in the garden behind the community center. The afternoon was still, with weak rays of sunlight piercing through the leaves, casting long shadows across his face. It was the first time in days that John wasn't interrupted by work or the prying eyes around him. Yet the silence brought no comfort. He looked down at his hands. These were the hands that had once gripped a baton, pressed forcefully against the body of Jamal Price, a man who had neither resisted nor carried a weapon, only helplessness. John took a deep breath, but the air seemed trapped in his chest. For the first time, he felt it deeply. These hands hadn't just hurt someone else, they'd left invisible scars on him as well. Did I do the right thing? The familiar thought surfaced, but this time it failed to convince him. Instead, other questions began to invade his mind. If it was right, why can't I sleep at night? Why does the image of that young man keep haunting me? John remembered Jamal's eyes that day. They weren't the eyes of an enemy or a dangerous person. They were the eyes of someone afraid, someone who didn't understand why they were being treated this way. What was I afraid of? John wondered. The young man hadn't carried a weapon, nor had he acted threateningly. All he had done was exist in a moment when John had chosen power over understanding. His hands trembled as a strange sensation washed over him. Regret. It wasn't a feeling he was familiar with, nor one he wanted to confront. But now, it was undeniable. John clasped his hands together, bowing his head low, as a heaviness settled on his chest. A voice behind him broke the stillness, gentle yet startling enough to make him flinch. "What are you thinking about?" John looked up to see Maria standing a few steps away, her hands clasped behind her back. She wasn't smiling. Her expression was serious but free of judgment. "Nothing," John replied quickly, his voice hoarse. Maria stepped closer, uninvited. She sat down beside him, maintaining a silence for a few moments, as though giving him space to gather his thoughts. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm yet piercing. "Have you ever thought that your anger doesn't just hurt others, it destroys you too?" John raised his head and met Maria's gaze. Her question hit like a hammer against the walls he had built around himself over the years. "What are you talking about?" John asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. Maria gave a faint smile, not answering right away. Instead, she looked out at the garden before them. "The first time I came home with this scar," she said, touching the faint mark on her face, "I thought I was ruined. But then I realized the real wound wasn't on my face. It was inside me. It was the anger, the resentment I couldn't let go of." She turned back to John, her voice softening but losing none of its edge. "Have you ever wondered why you react the way you do when someone challenges you? Why you feel the need to use power to hide something deeper inside?" John didn't answer. He couldn't. Maria's words forced him to confront himself. something he had avoided for far too long. Maria didn't wait for a response. She stood up, leaving John sitting alone on the bench. Before walking away, she added, "You can keep running, or you can start changing. It's up to you, but I don't think you have much time left to decide." John sat there, watching as Maria's figure disappeared among the trees. Her words lingered in his mind. "Anger destroys you." The phrase echoed in John's thoughts, forcing him to confront a truth he didn't want to admit. His anger wasn't strength, it was weakness, and that weakness hadn't just hurt those he directed it at, it had destroyed the man he used to be. That quiet afternoon, for the first time in years, John Carter sat and faced himself, a man torn between power and regret, between anger and the longing to discover what true strength really meant. John Carter woke up the next morning with a strange feeling. The conversation with Maria from the previous day lingered in his mind, but it no longer carried the discomfort it once did. Instead, something stirred within him, a vague urge, as though he needed to do something to break the empty cycle he had been trapped in for so long. When he walked into the center, John no longer wore his usual cold demeanor. He looked around, paying attention to the people he had previously ignored. Every glance, every word, every small action they took carried a meaning he had never bothered to notice. That afternoon, as he passed by the storage area, John heard shuffling noises and heavy breathing. He stopped, frowning as he saw Maria struggling with a large box, her face glistening with sweat. John's first instinct was to walk past, as he often did with things outside his responsibilities. But another thought crept into his mind. Why not help? Without hesitation, John stepped forward. "Let me," he said, his voice firm but without a commanding tone. Maria looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. Instead of saying anything, she stepped back, letting John lift the box. It was heavier than he expected, but he didn't stop. When he set it down in the corner of the room, John sighed and wiped the sweat from his brow. He turned to look at Maria, not waiting for her gratitude. But Maria didn't speak immediately. She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze not one of judgment or doubt. It was the look of someone who had been waiting for something, and now she was seeing it. "Thank you," Maria said, her voice gentle but resolute. She didn't need to say more, but she continued as if wanting him to truly understand. "I know you can do better than this." John froze. Maria's words weren't a compliment or encouragement. They were a challenge filled with the belief that he could change, that he wasn't the stubborn and self-satisfied man he had always seen himself as. Those words didn't just surprise him. They made him feel seen in a way he never had before. For years, John had defined himself by power and physical strength. But now, a simple act, a small gesture no one had asked of him, had opened a door to a new perspective on himself. That afternoon, as John continued his work at the center, he felt a shift in how he saw things. Tasks he had once considered burdensome no longer carried the same weight. While washing dishes in the kitchen, he realized it wasn't just manual labor. It was part of an effort to create a pleasant space for people he had once dismissed. When he spoke with Joe, he didn't just listen to respond, but truly cared about what Joe had to say. John began to understand that strength wasn't just about control or dominance. It was also about supporting, accompanying, and acknowledging his own vulnerabilities. That evening, as John prepared to leave the center, he saw Maria standing near the entrance. She was leaning against the wall, her eyes softly following him. "Tomorrow will be easier," Maria said, a gentle smile forming on her lips. John nodded, not replying, but deep down he knew she was right. Tomorrow would be easier, not because the work would change, but because he had started to change. This was just the first step, but it was enough for John to realize that the next steps were no longer something he had to do out of obligation. They were something he wanted to do, because for the first time in a long while, he was beginning to feel the true meaning of existence. The following days at the center, John Carter began to find a new rhythm in his work. He no longer acted out of mere obligation, but had learned to engage more actively, a change he himself hadn't fully recognized. However, the memory of the incident with Jamal Price remained a quiet shadow, persistently haunting him. John hadn't expected to face the young man, not until the moment it actually happened. One morning, while John was tidying up the common area, he heard footsteps and an unfamiliar voice behind him. At first, he paid no attention, but when he turned around, he felt his heart skip a beat. Jamal Price stood there in the middle of the room. He looked completely different from the last time John had seen him. Gone was the frail, fearful, or helpless demeanor. Jamal was taller, his youthful face filled with determination, but his eyes, those eyes, remained the same. They were the eyes John could never forget, the eyes that once looked at him with utter confusion and profound hurt. Jamal had come to the center to participate in a youth support program that coincided with John's community service duties. When their eyes met, John felt an invisible weight pressing on his chest. He quickly turned away, trying to avoid Jamal's gaze, but guilt and fear flooded his mind. In that moment, all John wanted was to disappear, to evade the inevitable confrontation. But Jamal wasn't going to let that happen. Hours later, as John was rearranging chairs, Jamal approached him. There was no anger or urgency in his steps, just a calmness that unsettled John even more. "Mr. Carter," Jamal called his name. John froze, his hands gripping the last chair. Slowly, he turned around, his eyes meeting Jamal's. Jamal stood there, arms crossed, but there was no defiance or hostility in his posture. Instead, his voice was soft, though each word cut like a blade. "Have you ever thought about how I felt?" That question hit John like an arrow straight to his mind. "How you felt?" John repeated, his voice hoarse. Jamal didn't break eye contact, his composure unwavering. "How I felt when you pushed me to the ground, when you hit me, when I lay there wondering why someone like you would do that to me. Have you ever thought about that?" John swallowed hard, searching for words to justify himself, but nothing came. For the first time, he couldn't turn his back, nor could he rely on authority to shield him. Jamal didn't yell or accuse, but his calmness made John feel utterly exposed. John lowered his head, his hands tightening around the chair, the weight on his shoulders heavier than ever. Jamal's question wasn't just about that day, it was about everything John had done in his past. John tried to speak, but his voice cracked. Jamal studied him for a long moment, then stepped closer. "I don't need your apology," he said, his tone no longer cold, but deeper, softer. "What I need is for you to understand that your actions didn't just leave bruises on my body. They shattered my trust in people who were supposed to protect me." John felt his throat tighten. For the first time, he had no excuses. He couldn't claim he was just doing his duty. He couldn't insist he was right. In front of Jamal, every justification he'd used to shield himself felt hollow. "You have every right to be angry," John whispered, his voice breaking with each word. I have no excuse." Jamal looked at him, a faint, sorrowful smile appearing on his face. "I don't want your excuses. I want you to change." John lifted his head, and in that moment, he saw something he hadn't realized before, an opportunity to make amends. Jamal hadn't come to punish him, but to remind him that change wasn't impossible, as long as he had the courage to face the truth. Jamal turned and walked away, leaving John standing alone in the room. His question still echoed in John's mind, impossible to erase. "Have you ever thought about how I felt?" For the first time in years, John felt stripped bare before the truth, without any defenses to hide behind. But instead of fear, he realized this was the first step toward reclaiming his true self. As Jamal's figure disappeared behind the door, his gaze lingered in John's mind like a quiet, smoldering flame, illuminating a path John had never thought he would take. On the last day of serving his sentence at the center, John Carter felt an odd sense of relief. Not because he was about to gain his freedom, but because, for the first time, he no longer felt imprisoned by his own arrogance and anger. His conversation with Jamal had been the breaking point, shattering the defenses he had built over the years. As he stepped out of the center, John looked back at the place that had changed him in ways he never expected. Maria, Joe, James, and Jamal, people he once disregarded, had now left indelible marks on him. At the Los Angeles County Courthouse, John entered the courtroom once again, but this time he no longer carried himself with arrogance, nor did he wear a defiant gaze or a smug smile. Instead, he walked slowly, his shoulders slightly slumped, his eyes fixed on Judge Harriet Grant's bench as if facing his own conscience. The courtroom was less crowded than before, yet the gazes from the audience still weighed on him. This time, though, that weight was something he was ready to bear, not avoid. When Harriet Grant looked up at him, her sharp, authoritative gaze remained unchanged, but now it held a hint of expectation. "Mr. Carter," Harriet began, her steady voice resonating throughout the room, "you've completed 300 hours of community service and participated in the required courses. Today, we are here to assess whether you truly understand the meaning of this sentence." John took a deep breath and stepped forward. He stood upright, meeting Harriet's gaze without flinching, but for the first time, he made no effort to appear superior. "Your Honor," he began, his voice devoid of its usual rigidity, replaced instead with rare sincerity, "I am here today not to defend myself, but to acknowledge that I was wrong, not just to Jamal, but to everyone I once looked down upon and hurt." He paused, lowering his eyes slightly as though searching for the right words within himself. "I used to think power made me strong, but I was wrong. It only blinded me to my responsibilities. These past weeks at the center have taught me that true strength lies not in control, but in understanding and acting for others." The room fell silent. Not a word was spoken, not even a whisper. Only John's voice lingered in the still air. Harriet remained quiet for a long moment, her eyes scrutinizing every word, every expression on his face. Then she gently removed her glasses, placed them on the bench, and leaned forward. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice calm yet commanding, "admitting your faults is the first step, but the next step is to act on that understanding. only that will prove you truly grasp the consequences of your actions." She paused, her gaze fixed on John's face, as if measuring the depth of his transformation. "I don't just expect remorse from you. I expect you to use this lesson to bring about something positive for the community you once oversaw. Your transformation will not be proven by your words here today, but by your actions in the days to come." John nodded, feeling her words not as a judgment, but as a guide. He turned to face the audience, where Jamal Price sat with his mother, Angela Price. As their eyes met, John felt a wave of nervousness rise within him, but this time he didn't look away. He drew a deep breath and spoke, his voice trembling but clear. "Jamal, I want to apologize, not just for what I did to you, but for failing to see you as a person. I let power and anger blind me to my real responsibilities. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I promise I will never make the same mistake again." Jamal looked at him for a long moment before giving a slight nod. He said nothing, but his eyes no longer held the coldness they had during their first encounter. Judge Harriet picked up her gavel and struck it against the bench, officially closing the session. But for John, this was not the end. It was only the beginning, a beginning he knew would require a lifetime to truly atone for the wrongs of his past. As he stepped out of the courthouse, John felt the warmth of the sun on his face like never before. For the first time, he didn't feel weighed down by the stares of others because he knew he was ready to change, not just for himself, but for those he had wronged. A new chapter awaited, and this time, John knew he would walk the path that was right. John Carter stepped out of the courthouse into the bright midday sunlight, but this time he didn't feel it as an unforgiving light exposing his guilt or failure. It felt like a new beginning, a chance to prove that what he had learned wasn't just empty theory. Though he had completed his sentence, John couldn't shake the feeling that he still owed life something. A few days later, he returned to the Los Angeles Veteran Support Center, not out of obligation, but out of genuine will. When John entered the center again, the atmosphere seemed unchanged. Familiar faces turned to look at him, but this time their gazes weren't filled with surprise or suspicion. Maria was the first to recognize him. Standing near the window, her eyebrows raised slightly at the sight of him walking in, but the expression quickly shifted into a soft smile. "You're back?" Maria asked, her tone laced with a hint of humor. John nodded, a faint smile forming on his lips. "I think I have a few things left to do here." Maria didn't say much, just nodded, but her eyes sparkled as if she'd seen something she had hoped for all along. John began immersing himself in the center's activities voluntarily. He no longer viewed tasks like cleaning, organizing, or assisting veterans as burdens. They became part of his journey of redemption, a way to atone for his mistakes and rediscover the true meaning of responsibility. But John didn't stop there. He decided to expand his transformation. He joined advanced training sessions for law enforcement officers, sharing the lessons he had learned at the center. He spoke about understanding communities, the real responsibilities of law enforcement, and how power should be wielded to build rather than destroy. The lessons he shared weren't just about policing. They were deeply personal stories, moments when he had to face himself, the people who had changed him. Maria, James, Joe, and especially Jamal weren't just names. They were living proof of the power of forgiveness, compassion, and the ability to overcome pain to strive for something better. One late afternoon, as the golden sunset streamed through the center's windows, John stood in the common room, talking with Maria and a group of veterans. The room was filled with laughter. The barriers of mistrust and unfamiliarity that once existed between him and those who had looked at him as an outsider had vanished. Maria, sitting in a chair, offered a light yet meaningful smile. "I told you," she teased, "you could do better than that." John laughed but didn't reply. Instead, he glanced around the room where the stories and the people had become an integral part of his life. The image of John, a man who once abused his power and disregarded responsibility, now standing among those he once dismissed as the weak, marked the closure of an important chapter in his life. He was no longer arrogant or self-satisfied. John Carter was now a man who understood the true meaning of strength, the strength to build, protect, and repair. John's story isn't a perfect ending, but it's a powerful reminder. Everyone makes mistakes, but what truly matters is what we learn from them and how we work to make things right. John Carter had lost so much, but he had found something he never knew he needed: compassion and the true meaning of responsibility. With the sunset casting its warm glow through the windows, John felt a peace he had never known before. This wasn't an ending, but a new beginning, a start he was ready to face with humility and determination. John Carter's journey is not just about a man finding his way back to the right path. It's also a profound reminder to all of us. True strength doesn't lie in power or control, but in compassion, understanding, and the ability to repair what is broken. If you were John Carter, how would you face your past? Would you have the courage to change and make a difference? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more meaningful stories. We are always here to explore life's lessons with you.